Hi there, and welcome back to the Weekly Why. This week, the parsha is called Vayetze. Just a brief recap: we have Jacob, who's Abraham's grandson. Again, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob is now he's fled from his brother Esau. See last week's video, and he is now working for his evil uncle Lavan, who is basically he's trying to marry Rachel. And Lavan is basically screwing him over one after another. First, he makes him work 7 years for Leah, and then he makes him work 7 years for Rachel. Okay, so here's a guy who is basically, Jacob is working and being abused, and Torah says that his wage was changed 10 times, and 10 times, Rashi says it was 100 times it was changed. In other words, he's working for somebody who is totally manipulative, evil, just a real son of a gun. And there's a whole bunch of lessons here, and it's interesting that Jacob never really argues or fights back. Only after he gets a vision from God and from God saying, you gotta leave, does he ever leave. And only then, when publicly, he flees with Rachel and Leah, Lavan's two daughters, and he flees. And then Lavan sends a group of thugs to chase after him. And then later on, Lavan, when he finally catches up with him, he publicly accuses Jacob of stealing from him. And only then does Jacob, basically freak out at Lavan. The question is, where was Jacob during that 14 years? Now, he was actually with him for 20 years, but where was he with him for that 14 years? Imagine you were, you wanted to marry someone, and you're in the olden days, and your father said, you have to work 7 years before you marry my daughter, Rachel. And you say, well, you know what, fine, I'll do it. And then you work those 7 years, and then he says, oh, well, you know what, I didn't mean Rachel, I meant Leah, because, we don't marry the older ones second. So you would now have to do it for another 7 years, and you just take it. I mean, you don't decide to, maybe you try to off the guy, maybe you just try to marry the daughter anyway, maybe you try to elope, maybe you just say forget the whole thing. I mean, Jacob seems to be a real pushover, and there's a number of lessons here. One is that Jacob saw in Rachel not just a pretty woman or a good wife, a good shidduch. He saw that the future of the Jewish people would descend from Rachel. So the reason that he had this single-minded focus on Rachel was not because he saw her as a particularly good marriage candidate, or only because of that, because he saw that the future of the Jewish people depended on that union. And so this is what was so important. Secondly, he had that focus that no matter what stood in the way, that was the only thing that was important. And so that was the reason that he wouldn't let anything happen in the way. But the question is, why would he let himself to be beaten up? And so, of course, the take-home lesson for us is that, does that mean that we should be pushovers? Was Jacob a pushover? And why did Jacob later on with Lavan, when Lavan, accused him of stealing, that all of a sudden now he fight back? The point is that later on, when Lavan accused Jacob of stealing, it was no longer a personal thing. In other words, haha, I screwed you over, you have to work for me more and more. It wasn't that anymore. It changed. What changed was that this was no longer a personal attack, but it was a desecration of God's name. Because Lavan was no longer saying, oh, you know what, Jacob, I'm going to change your terms and change it and change it. He later on said, you know what, you are nothing but a criminal. Because later on he accuses Jacob of stealing these things. He said, you're nothing but a criminal. And so what that says is that even the most righteous people, even you, Jacob, who everyone thinks is so righteous and so religious, you're nothing but a petty thief. And so I think the lesson for us is that, far from being a pushover, Jacob simply didn't care about Lavan's changing his wages and changing everything else. It simply was unimportant to him, because he saw that the only real important thing was that he needed to father the Jewish people with Rachel. And so that was the only important thing. Everything else was unimportant. And again, the take-home lesson, I think, for us is that not that we should be pushovers, but when we see, the future of the Jewish people in our hands, everything else is unimportant. Everything else doesn't matter. We know we can achieve it, and when everything else is just nonsense to wade through. And of course, why did Jacob then freak out at Lavan only when he accused him of, basically stealing publicly? It was no longer an issue of simply pride. It was a desecration of God's name. He's saying there is no such thing as a religious Jew. Even the people who seem religious and holy, they're not. So again, the one take-home lesson for us, I think, is that when we have that single-minded focus on the concern for our fellow man, on the Jewish people, just as Jacob did, everything else is unimportant. We don't think we're smart enough, or rich enough, or knowledgeable enough, or persuasive enough. Whatever it is, we know that there are issues. We know we care about our fellow people. everything else is unimportant. We have that single-minded focus on that. And of course, when we don't succeed or when we're beaten down, we should not see it as a matter of personal pride while we're not succeeding. It's not, or we are succeeding. It's not a matter of personal issue. It's a matter of we doing something l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And so, like Jacob, who didn't fight when he wasn't getting his paychecks and when Lavan was screwing him over, that's not what made him angry. What made him angry is when Lavan basically said, you know what, there's no such thing as a righteous person. That is the thing that we should be angered by. We should be angered not by our personal failures, by the concept that when the desecration of the Jewish people, when people say, you know what, even the Jewish people themselves don't care about their own people. So of course, we can take home the lesson from Jacob and in his fight with Lavan and truly be an inspiration to ourselves and in the community. Best wishes, Shabbat Shalom, God bless.